Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So dear students, welcome to the very exciting course Soft Tissue Characterization and Applications. We had been talking about a lot of things, like from different kinds of testing methods for soft tissues to where all different soft tissues have to be tested in which way or the other, so we'll be discussing about a lot of applications and other things. But as we go on this journey, what we need to cover is ethics around soft tissue testing, because that takes almost the center stage when you're conducting research or any kind of, be it academic or industrial research on with soft tissues, with soft human tissues or animal models or anything like that. Ethics in testing with tissues is something which will keep on coming back to you, and which can impede you to do further research or publish research, right? In order to do that, we would like to learn some of the key things about the ethics. What does it actually mean? How important is that? How things have evolved over time. So let's get started. Okay, so during this lecture, what we are going to cover is what exactly is research ethics. That's the first question we would like to get some answers on. Second is, if you are looking at scientific research, what is the difference between social and clinical research, and how ethics takes a center stage in all of those activities, right? Why should you be concerned with research ethics? This is another question we would like to answer in terms of how research is conducted, what are the right practices, wrong practices, and things like that. The next thing we will be looking at is development and evolution of research ethics, over time. Is this something which has started like in the past 10 years or 5 years? So this has always been around. Things have evolved over time. So it's more of an evolutionary process, right? So how was this evolution going on, and what is the chronology of things? Those are some of the things we'll be looking at, right? Codes and regulations which were developed around those evolution, as well as the international landscape, how things moved into the direction of ethics, right? What members of the research ethics committee look for in your ethics proposal? So typically, when we understand everything about ethics and we are about to start some testing with soft tissues, especially animal or human tissues, or how does your proposal be somewhat acceptable, or what are the key components of your proposal which should be there, right? So those are the things we are going to look at. Next is how to submit a proposal for ethical clearance. We'll be just streamlining all the understandings and looking at what are the key components of an ethical proposal, right? So with this background, we are going to get started on each one of these questions, and we'll start to look for answers. Okay. So what exactly is research ethics comes from two questions which needs to be understood. First, what is ethics and what is research, right? Research is particularly where we are basically trying to find certain problems which are existing in the society, and it could be incremental problems, they could be problems at large, and we will try to devise some solutions to understand how to, either we have an understanding of the problem in general, like we have a deeper understanding into certain diseases, for example, or you want to look at the intervention or methods to prevent it or diagnose it, or post assess it and post uh, conduct a proper hiatus to the issues like which are conducted due to like some form of disease or injury. So those kind of things you want to look at through research experiments, through research computations and whatnot. So that's what research is. Ethics, however, is more of just having a right moral understanding of what things are right in general, yeah, in the world, right? What are good practices, what are wrong practices, right? Like, so for example, talking back to people is not a good thing, right? Like, that's a wrong practice, so that's kind of unethical. Or doing something without informing somebody, which is not a good practice, is unethical, right? So that's where the sense of ethics comes, and this has its own like boundaries, and it can vary from one person to another. Like, it's not like what the kind of ethics I hold is what the kind of ethics you're going to hold, right? But when these two terms are put together, ethics and research, which are both subjective terms, there are certain boundaries in which they are kind of put together, and there are certain code of conducts to make sure that it is uniform across the globe, and in certain cases uniform in certain localities, right? Like, we want to make sure that if somebody is doing an animal experiment for whatever reasons, right, they might be trying a new medical device, versus somebody is doing an animal tissue experiment for understanding the tissue characteristics, they should have some very similar guidelines in terms of maintaining the right ethics for their research, irrespective of the type of research. So that's where the research ethics comes into the picture. Hopefully, this initial component is clear, and we'll delve deeper and deeper into the system. So let's look further into the definition of ethics from a bookish standpoint. So ethics is basically a discipline dealing with what is a proper course of action for man. So when they use the term man, that corresponds to both men and women. I think that's how the literature used to be written back in the day. So it's not specifically that word I am using. It's cited by Aristotle, Machion, 1941. So that this is one of the cited words, sentence from there, right? So whatever is the proper course of action for any of us as an individual, that's the discipline of that is known as ethics, right? From a definition standpoint, it is a branch of philosophy that looks at what is good and what is bad. Like I just explained, it's a system of obligation that we have towards each other, right? So that's very important. If I go and hurt somebody, that's not a right thing, right? So these kind of things are usually taught to us by our parents, or we from our surroundings, our teachers. We kind of imbibe certain disciplines within our system, and that forms our ethical system, right? Ethics is also sometimes known as the moral philosophy, involves systematic defending and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior, right? So there are times where somebody may show a behavior which they feel it's acceptable, but the other persons at large like do not feel that is acceptable. So there is a thin line of demarcation between what can be considered as an ethical behavior versus what is not. But of course, some are very standard practices. You do good to others, you do not hurt anybody. So these are common ethical disciplines which all of us should have, right? So, a study of principles guiding the good of an individual within the context of social interactions and the community. That's very important. So, how do you judge whether a certain activities or certain practices are good or bad? So, they have to be defined within the perspective of a social community which does a certain set of interactions, right? I'll give you a very quick example. So, for example, if you from a medical field, if you work and with any kind of wearable technologies, you may be able to test them in healthy subjects very quickly without ethical clearance. This is just a random statement I'm just giving as an example. So, this may be true for somebody sitting in a country where the rules and laws and regulations around wearable technologies are not very well defined just yet. That's totally fine. But if you go to another country where this rules and laws are very well defined, you have to comply with certain rules and laws, right? Another philosophical example is, let's say you address somebody in a manner that, okay, so like these animals can be used for these kind of tests, or for they're already part of a fooding habit, so they can be ran experiments, we can run experiments on them. For example, in China, this is just so let's say they eat a certain type of animal. Let's say, for example, pigs or any particular animal. They're eaten all around the world, but at that point they may feel like, oh, this is okay, like if you sacrifice the animal for clinical testing. But that may be looked upon in a very different manner if you're in the US, right, or if you're in the Europe. So there are different laws governing different places. For example, if you look at certain animals in the uh, Asian countries, like Arabic countries, for example, they may be looked upon in a different way. So it's a study of principles guiding the good of an individual within the context of a social interaction and the community. So these components are very important while defining ethics, right? So that's why ethical guidelines or ethical rules sometimes will may not transcend the boundaries of the nations and may be nation specific. Okay. So ethics as a theoretical enterprise, there are different terms which are put around ethics. One of the terms is metaethics. It's a branch of analytical philosophy that explores the status, foundation, and scope of moral values, properties, and words. Right. The source is from this Princeton directory, but that's a definition of metaethics. Normative ethics is addresses the questions of what ought to be done, right? Normative ethical theorists like Socrates, Kant, Stewart, Bentham seeks to provide action guides and codes, right? So another example is if you are religious in a certain way, then you are following certain ethics there, right? So these ethical guidelines have a lot of regional specificity, and many a times they change, like if you go from one place to another, right? Then comes the applied ethics, which is focused on the domain specific ethics, such as if you're looking at business policies, you're looking at biomedical, APA, engineering, etc. So there are certain ethical guidelines and rules to be followed, right? So one example is you have to take an ethical clearance before you can perform experiments on a live animal or a live human. Or in certain countries, it may not be allowed at all, right? So that's what is applied ethics, and we have to keep all of these in mind, specifically when we are working with soft issues. That's why this context is very, very important. So let's look next into the evolution of ethics, how things have moved on. It will be an interesting find to look at these. So Aristotle, back in 384 to 322 BC, that's quite a while back, proposed a theory of virtue, right? So that's where the ethics, the incidence of starting point of genesis of ethics, the word and its implications really started off from. Then you have the Socrates from 469 to 399 BC. Then you are looking at Siddhartha Gautama, 563 to 480 BC. They had different statements and ways of following ethics. Kant in 1724 to 1804, quite a while, right? Like almost you're looking at 80 years. Looked at the rightness of an action is determined by the character of the principle that a person chooses to act upon, right? So these kind of, so there were certain rules and guidelines and things like that, right? Further into the ethics evolution, you look at Bentham 1781, which we looked at the principle of utility, right? So things were looked at upon, like not through philosophy, not through understanding, but much into the practical setting as the times progressed, where disapproves or approves of every action according to tendency to adjustment, uh, augment or diminish happiness, right? So everything was looked upon in terms of happiness, for example, happiness or utility, right? Like, so if a particular action is going to imbibe happiness to others around you, that is a good ethics. So if it is not making people happy around you, it's wrong ethics, right? So this is how the philosophically ethics has evolved. So then followed by, we have a very unique period by Mahatma Gandhi ji, from 1869 to 1948, where a lot of ethical principles have evolved over his journey and his guidelines and whatever wisdom here to bestow over the world, right? Like, so that's where this era was looked around for. Then comes around the same time frame, you're looking at Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, who are very popular figures who have been able to devise certain rules and regulations for the ethics between 1918 and 2013. That's almost very close by, right? If you're looking at Africa, you're looking at Fanon, 1925 to 1961, who looked at philosophy of humaneness and things like that, right? So across the globe, there have been several very influential and renowned and very nice people who have been able to devise the different ethical guidelines or practices around it. And of course, there were many other things and aspects involved, but they had a very good influence on how the ethical practices have evolved over time. So this just shows a chronology of all those things. Okay, so as we understand a little bit about ethics, like we have learned about how the chronology worked, what ethics definition is. Let's look a little bit into the key features of scientific research, and then we can connect both of these together as scientific ethics, right? Like, or ethics for science. So the key features of scientific research includes several different components which are of need and use. The first one is known as scientific rigor, which basically means that truth is accepted if there is sufficient evidence to support claims made through the research process. Such claims have to withstand the scrutiny of repeated testing. So if you perform an experiment, if you do any kinds of testing, you have to repeat that experiment many a times, and it whatever the results are, that should be justified with some evidence which has uh, been shown back in like 5 years back or 10 years back or 20 years back and so forth by fellow researchers who are of the similar rigor. So that's where the concept of peer review comes into the place, right? You're looking at peers who have worked in similar areas and may have established certain good area of research findings, right? So scientific rigor basically looks at repeatability of your tests. You have to keep on repeating your tests and make sure it is rigorously done and can be backed by scientific evidence. Otherwise, if you just get a random result which is not scientific or which cannot be fit within the laws of science, it is not considered a meaningful or proper research, right? So that's the number one feature of scientific research. The next one is generalizability of findings, right? Like, that's the top one. The extent to which a sample used in the research project reflects the broader population of interest. So for example, if I am looking at a certain kind of soft tissue and maybe the mechanics of that soft tissue, how it degrades or ruptures and things like that under fatigue loading or normal kind of cyclic loading and whatnot, these results should be applicable to me. It should be applicable to an American. It should be applicable to a Korean person. It should be applicable to a Chinese person or an Australian person, right? Like, this should not be a research which is very, very specific only to a particular context of people. There can be research which are within the Indian context, but it should have a wider mass of people. Let's say it's a research conducted on population of Kerala for a certain disease or certain injury, right? That can be there, but it should not be research conducted on me as only person, and this research cannot be translated anywhere else. So that's not a generalizable finding, right? So research should have an implication on the lives of others. That could be more than two, more than many. It could be a very specific disease which we are trying to look at, which has just 50 people suffering from it, which we are trying to solve, or it could be a broader group of population, but it should not be just one, right? So you would often hear the terms patient specific research and things like that. So that may seem to be very specific to a patient, but those patient specific studies are also conducted to find some broader results, right? So research in no way is there to limit the scope of the application, right? The third feature of good scientific research is universality and objectivity, right? So it should be universal and it should be objective, right? We should not tell or talk about results which are subjective, which may change when the conditions completely change. So that is not of much value to the general public, right? So what this specifically means is explicit rules and systematic procedures have to be maintained, right? Research should be designed in a manner that allows any competent research to conduct a similar study and generate the similar findings, right? So if I conduct a research with soft tissues or very cancerous tumors or any other drug delivery applications or any other specific area, this research should be reproducible. That is the term to be used, reproducible in somewhere in America or somewhere in Korea, somewhere in Australia. A competent researcher should be able to do and get similar results. If they are not able to find it, then that means the research is flawed, or it may in certain cases have some ethical issues, right? Maybe there are a certain type of animals it has been tested on which are not available anywhere. That can also be a case, right? Or there is a certain test things which you want to protect the IP of that, like you do not want to share too much of knowledge, then a competent researcher may not be able to do that. But in most cases of good research, it should be reproducible, it should be repeatable, it should be reproducible. Next is, and which is very important, is originality of research work, which basically means original ideas backed with appropriate evidence in clear, logical, and convincing argument that illustrates critical and analytical thinking. So research should never be like a copy of somebody's work, right? And that's considered to be plagiarism. I'm going to explain that term as well, right? So it should always be that yeah, you can adapt a few things from somewhere, like for example, somebody has done something and you want to use a similar method and test a few new things with a new method and new analysis technique. That's completely fine, but just you have to make sure that you acknowledge and cite those particular researchers, right? That is very important. So that makes sure that your research is original, even though it could be incremental and using a lot of principles and methods which others have already developed, but it has to have something original. It can be originality in terms of the methods, in terms of the outcomes, or in terms of the approach, or what we are expecting as a future finding, right? So that's why we call it original research or review paper and things like that. Review paper is when you're just reviewing the work of others. Original research is where you're taking a step ahead of what others may have done, and this is a new step in that direction which nobody has attempted to perform, right? So hopefully this key features of good scientific research or scientific research in general is clear. So research ethics, now we are going to tie up both. We have talked about ethics philosophically, we have talked about research philosophically. Now we are going to tie both, right? So research ethics therefore are a code of guidelines on how to conduct scientific research in a morally acceptable way. When we tie both the philosophies together to make sure the outcomes are repeatable, reproducible, original, and of good nature and done in the right way, right? Second is principles and standards that help researchers to uphold the value and standards of knowledge construction. If this code of conduct is not there, then anybody can cook up anything, cook up any kind of solution, but that's going to not benefit anybody in the mankind, right? So that's why the ethics, understanding the ethical guideline, ethical practices is of utmost importance when we are dealing with any sort of uh, learning such as the soft tissue mechanics. So whenever we are looking at soft tissue testing, they have to follow ethical guidelines. Human testing, ethical guidelines. Gate analysis, yes, ethical guidelines have to be followed, right? So there are principles and standards which have been set, which have to be followed, and there are certain committees and formations which kind of have a little bit of policing on this activities, so as to make sure that everything is conforming and done in good faith, right? So it is a very similar analogous thought to not having police at all, right? Like, let's say there is a city and there is no police station, no police, then anybody can do any sort of crime, right? That's why you have some policing. It's very similar. You have standard sets and guidelines for this, right? Like for the research ethics. Okay, so what are the ethical considerations in the research process? So ethical considerations comes into play at 6 stages of research particularly. So first of all, when you're conceptualizing and designing of the study, right? So let's say at the very first step, when you're trying to conduct a research, be it industrial or academic, you are going to look at conceptualizing how your research is going to look at and hypothesize that these are some possible outcomes or results I may expect. That is known as a research hypothesis, for example. So during the conceptualization, you need to be mindful of the scientific merit. Is this what you're thinking something legit, like which you think is valuable to the society? And third is like, can it really do something which is in the rigor of science, right? Or are you trying to think something which is completely unscientific, right? So if I have water in the glass and I basically put the glass upside down, if I say the water is going to flow up, that's just unscientific, right? So we have to talk in terms of scientific merit. We have to also identify risks and ways to mitigate the risk. So there is always a risk in original research where you may not get results which you hypothesize, or your test specimens may go bad. There is a lot of biological research where you have it takes hours and days to build test specimens or test benches, and then when you go there to use it, something gets contaminated and you're not able to conduct your research the way you thought you would be able to, right? So that conceptualization phase needs to very carefully and honestly identify the scientific merit of the work which you are going to undertake, identify risks and ways to mitigate the risk. What are my alternatives if things go bad? So we have to think in all those directions, right? So that's a part of the ethical consideration, because if you have not planned for it, then sometimes researchers can get frustrated and just make up or cook up solutions and things like that. So that's where the research breaches happen. In order for that to not happen, you need to think in all the possible directions on what all things may go wrong. Still, there may be things which do go wrong, which you have not expected. You have to find means and ways to correct it rather than circumventing it, right? Next is when participants are recruited in the process of informed consents. So you have to be focused on process of informed consent and right to privacy. So what this means are, let's say you're doing some human subject study where I could do something as simple as I'm just trying to put an extensometer and measure the muscle stiffness or skin stiffness at a particular location. It could be an experiment as simple as that. But when I'm recruiting a participant, I should make it very, very clear to the participant what they're going to expect, and it should be the same as what they're going to expect, what I do in the experiment. It should never be a flowery picture that, oh, like it's a very easy experiment. You will not even feel a poke. You just sit there for 5 minutes and we'll just quickly take a poke and that's it. So that's not informing a participant. That's not ethically correct. So we should be informing a participant very clearly. So which is given in terms of a participation information sheet where there is a generalized and standard information about what research you are conducting and how their data which you are collecting is going to be used, right? Also, the right to privacy. Certain participants may not want their privacy to get jeopardized, right? So let's say you're looking at cancerous tumors in let's say 10 or 15 participants and you're trying to do some analytical research and things like that. You have to ask their consent that I'm trying to look at the tumor stiffness or things like that. This is the kind of data which I'm going to release. Probably you have to tell them very clearly that either I'm going to totally blind the participant name, that nobody is going to ever find it out from our journals or publications that who you were. It is just a study to look at what is the effect of cancerous tumor stiffness on, let's say, the cancer growth or things like that, right? So you have to be informing them very clearly so that their privacy is maintained. You should not be like taking pictures of 15 participants with their face on and you put their pictures on a publication. That's not correct, right? So typically, if you look at journal publications where participants are being used and some representative images are being used, typically there is a borderline or a black kind of box or a clear line which is placed on the eyes, mouth, nose, and these places from which the identification of a particular participant becomes difficult. So you want to make sure they cannot be identified. That is the typical norm. But there could be certain areas of research where you're studying the face and things like that, but their proper right to the privacy has to be maintained, right? You should inform everything to the participants and make sure that they allow you do what you're suggesting. If they allow you, only then you should use it. Otherwise, if you're using some data by telling them some other story and then later on using them in a different way, that is completely unethical, and any participant has the right to complain, and that can jeopardize your research further, right? So these are some this is the second practice, which is a very important thing, and sometimes is not followed, right? uh, Typically, if you are looking at a lot of small institutes and research institutes which are doing which have a dearth of funds or facilities and trying to do clinical research, I have heard stories about like people going to villages and places where they're doing some clinical research unethically by placing certain implants and devices into people and taking out data from them without telling them the real story. Uh, there was a there are a lot of documentaries and movies about it. Like one of the interesting ones, if you all watch television, is I think it's on Hotstar movie. It's known as Humans. It's a very interesting series. I'm sure not 100% of that is true. There would be some work of fiction, but that gives you an example of some clinical trials and where clinical trials can go ethically wrong. So maybe that could be a homework. You can watch that series if you would like, right? So this is very important. Telling the participant, who is a research participant, we sometimes call them as subjects, research subjects or research volunteers, they should be informed of everything which you are going to do during the experiments as well as with their data. That is a ultimate must for having high ethical standards, right? Next is during the intervention or measurement procedure to which participants are subjected to, you should be talking about management of risk, right? So let's say there is a certain drug which is delivered and you're testing it on participants, or there is a certain component of tissue which is removed to test something, or you wanted to look at skin grafting, for example. Let's say there is a burn patient and I want to take out a piece of skin and test it with some new technologies, like and look at whether the skin grafting is doing better or not as a part of research. This is just a random example. So you may think I'm doing a favor to this burn victim by trying new things, but that's not a favor. That's an unethical practice. You have to inform the participant if they are in the position to hear you out and give you consent, or you have to inform to some immediate family members who are possibly there to give you consent of doing such activities of research along with the clinical practice which is there. Unless and until that is done, that becomes totally unethical, and how their data is going to be used is also to be declared, right? So whenever there is a procedure, there are many a times there are implants and other items which are implanted within the body, and many times doctors or clinicians may say, oh, this is going to be the next big thing and you are the first test subject, we'll give you this for free and things like that. But that is totally unethical if they have been properly the risks which can occur and the mitigation strategies are not declared, right? So this is a very important slide if you're looking at basically the ethical considerations around soft tissue testing, right? So the fourth is in the release of results obtain protection of confidentiality and anonymity, right? Like this is, like I've already informed this, it's very important. Like whenever you are publishing some results taken from certain participants, you want to make sure that they're all the data is made anonymous so that nobody can predict from that publication, which becomes a public information, that what condition or what injury this particular patient may have. it can have hundreds of repercussions. It may uh, cause mental trouble to that participant. It may cause their job to be lost. There are so many other implications which may happen beyond what we can fathom, right? Like, so it's very important ethically to be correct while we do our research in that aspect, right? The sixth point is, after the release of the results, ensure that participants and communities involved in the research benefit, right? So we should not typically release results for the sake of academic work or sake of industrial showing up like that. We just want to showcase some results that some tests were conducted, or just to kind of convey that this is how the money of a funding agency was used. So those things should be kind of on a sideline, and what you should really focus is the benefit of the general public. Only whenever participants are involved and we have conducted some research, it should lead to something rather than just data generation, right, and publishing results. That's not a very good practice, and you'll be very surprised to hear that that's majorly what is done across the globe, right? Like, so that those practices are still not in place, and they are changing over time with a lot of fresh energy and whatnot, right? So this slide is of a lot of importance, which takes us into the basic nitty gritty of what should be the basic principle of 6 stages of the research in which we should be ethically right. Okay, so while we are talking about what is ethically right, there is another way of looking at research ethics, of understanding it better, by looking at what is ethically not right, or what is unethical research conduct. So it might be a nice idea to understand what is the unethical research conduct, to basically understand what should be the ethical practice, right? The first unethical conduct technique is known as deception, which is issues of full disclosure. So, which includes withholding information about the aim of the study. This has happened historically in very large studies as well as small studies around the globe, and India is no different, right? Like in India also, these kind of studies are always conducted, like every now and then, like to cut corners, like, so where you withheld information from the participants of what the implications of a drug is going to happen, or this particular tissue based bandage or some implants which are placed, what kind of changes this can cause to your body. So that is withholding of information, completely a legal offense. Like, that's not only ethical offense, it's a legal offense, right? So we have to be very mindful of not not withholding information while doing research from the participants on the aim of the study. That should be very clear. Second is misleading participants about the risks inherent in participating in the study. This is another very important thing, like very synonymous to this. I'll give you an example. We sometimes used to do like some studies in which we just take some pictures of certain participants and then have them run for a while, take some measurements like of their foot condition and the foot pressure measurements. So we may think a person can normally run or normally do activities, but there are few diabetic patients. Few of them may not benefit from running, and it can aggravate their conditions. So in a participant information sheet, for example, if this was the kind of research, I should clearly tell them that if you have a certain level of diabetes or some conditions where there can be breathlessness or things like that, this can often occur while you do the running exercise. So you may always have the chance to say a no while you have come for the research participation. That will allow and give the chance, a fair chance, to all the participants to say no by understanding what is going on. This is quite often avoided in majority of the research because you don't want to hear a no. Participants are not a lot whom you can rely on, and so many a times you will withhold information. That is not correct at all, right? So misleading participants and withholding information back are two unethical means of conducting research. Second is plagiarism. This is a very wide term, but typically what this means is when somebody copies somebody's intellectual property. Somebody's intellectual property means like something which is there copyright holding. So a lot of journal publications, papers, information, research data which has been generated, if they are copied and published in a very similar platform like in a journal, like that's totally plagiarism, right? And that can have very different implications at different levels, right? So any kind of copying, cheating, and these kind of things are not acceptable. Sometimes, like, copying the data and showcasing that this is your data or things like that, that is totally not acceptable. And uh, this is also very surprisingly very common around the world, and this specifically in a lot of countries, like where the opportunities are less, and you have uh, more influx of research output requirement and things like that. So where that is where the plagiarism happens a lot, right? Third is conducting research that does not have a scientific base, like ill-formed problem statement, right? So there are a lot of like research which has no sense at all, and you're trying to do something like, for example, you all of a sudden came out with a 3D printed implant, let's say, for example, and without knowing anything about the biocompatibility, biotoxicity, and things like that, you want to implant this 3D printed implant into an animal model. Now the animal cannot speak for itself, or but it is totally unethical. Without knowing the practices or the standard procedures what has to be followed in order to use a material into a animal system, you cannot be doing this kind of research. Or all of a sudden you come up with a 3D printed implant you want to place with that inside a human body, that's also not acceptable, right? So this is one clinical example, but there are so many research thought processes like which can be totally baseless, like from a scientific standpoint. So things like like probably if I cut a piece of soft tissue from here and place it there, it's going to lead to better growth, unless it is scientifically proven, like you cannot do that, right? Next is lack of objectivity and integrity in the design and conduct of research, right? This is again another unethical practice where this includes not identifying the methodological constraints of the study that determine the validity of the findings. So let's say you all of a sudden say that I'm going to test a particular tissue under vibration loads, and based on that I'm going to find out which kind of clothings or which kind of sensors have to be placed on this particular tissue, right? Let's say this is a problem statement. So you made this problem statement as a part of an industry or academics setting, but let's say you don't have a vibration testing bench, or you do not have access to too much of information on how vibration tests are to be conducted. Then you have methodological constraints, that you have defined a problem which you will not be able to pursue because of your constraints, method based constraints, right? Or let's say I want to bioprint some cells and some tissue cultures like into forming a particular artificial organ, but I don't have the recipes or the knowledge to culture that, or the facilities to culture or tissue engineer something, right? So then again it's a flawed method, right? Like which is not going to lead to anything. Next is misinterpretation of results. Sometimes this may happen inadvertently, sometimes it can be uh, really a reason that somebody is doing it purposefully. That is where you are looking at results. Sometimes the results are so minimal that you want to say something out loud with those results. Like for example, I'll give you, for example, the finite element modeling of a tissue, let's say, is showing that there is a stress concentration on the hip implant at this and this location. And all of a sudden, let's say I go out and declare that now I can say all the hip implants have to change the design in this particular location. So that is misinterpretation of a result. Unless I've done a proper validation study on things through proper stage of procedures, animal model tests, clinical tests, and things like that, even before that, like an experiment, right, to start with, then I'm misinterpreting the results. I'm just coming too close to the conclusion without further research, right? Sometimes you may interpret certain things in certain way, right, like which may not make sense, right? So this example again, for example, like this stress distribution on this implant may not actually indicate that you want to change the design there. It may indicate that you want to get rid of that particular region. So without advanced amount of knowledge in a particular area, it may be fairly easy to misinterpret results, and that is not a very correct notion of things for conducting research. So we should always look out for experts, like expert opinions and things, and peer review processes. That's why important to understand whether or not your results have been analyzed properly. Next is not providing details or of theories and methods that might be relevant in the interpretation of research findings, right? So there should be some scientific basis on which, again, I'm coming back to this example, I can indicate that this particular stress distribution has to lead to so and so design changes in the implant. If there is no scientific basis, or none of the declared researchers have ever talked about it, then it is not going to do anything better, right? So another example I'm going to give you is skin grafts have been tested widely for expansion, like whichever graft patterning technique can lead to maximum expansion in the skin, which can cover a larger burn site. This is a problem, right? So while this is being done, a study can all of a sudden claim that I meshed it in some other direction. It created a little bit extra, bulge or expansion to things. Now I can claim that this particular skin grafting technique is the most unique in the world, and this is going to solve or expand it by 1.5 times more from the traditional. Can I say these kind of statements? I cannot, right? Because I do not know the implication of this research, right? I may have theoretically or experimentally done certain things, but unless and until I try and test the skin grafting method over an animal model or with further trials, I will not be able to back it up unless there are some theories and methods which points towards it, right? So if I'm just doing baseless kind of conclusions out of some research, then that is unethical. Next is, of course, fabrication or falsification of data. That is completely unethical, that just to meet some end goals or cook up some results which are favorable, you have misinterpreted data. Misinterpretation would be a shorter term here. You have actually manipulated the data, so that is completely unethical, right? If found, this can kind of lead to end of the academic journey for many, or the research journey. Next is not following the appropriate ascription of authorship to a publication. So this is another unethical practice where sometimes, let's say for example, 3-4 people have worked together and the third person has worked the most for this research, and let's say the fourth person writes up or takes the write up of that person, makes it into a publication and publishes it. That's totally unethical, right? That can sometimes be considered as a part of plagiarism also, but that's a authorship issue as well, unethical authorship issue. Many a times it has been seen that papers are in preprint conditions and somebody has taken the data and published it elsewhere, in a special issue or somewhere, like, so those things are not right. Happens with the industries also sometimes, not only in academics. Academics, it's less happening these days because of the standard rules and procedures, but it happens in the industries also, where they are trying to show that a particular drug or a particular machine or a device is going to be the next big thing in the world. They will quickly publish the results, by copying some of the key results from, let's say, similar device in the US, or similar findings from the images in Europe or somewhere else, and this is very common. Vice versa, this can happen in the US and other places as well, right? But this is highly prevalent, in academics and the industry, so we have to be careful and mindful of these kind of activities. Authorship has to be properly decided, majorly through a principal investigator of a project, which, let's say, if I am running a project, then if my students have worked on it, I sit with them and basically decide that what should be the authorship. It should not be like that somebody just claims their authorship and publishes it, right? So those kind of arrangements should be properly and ethically done. Further things which are unethical, to understand basically what is ethical, is not respecting the right to privacy, right? So sometimes if we as a whole do not respect somebody's right of privacy and take out data, which many of the companies are doing by through health apps and other apps where you're constantly taking data. Let's say I take an ECG data of a person, and I report this on a publication or somewhere else, and that costs this particular person his job or other things, or it's a public humiliation of some sort of things like that. So the right to privacy of data is very, very important. That should not be breached, right? Next is not respecting the right to anonymity and confidentiality. So data should be kept completely confidential, should not be shared with other people, right? That is number one. And anonymity basically makes sure that data cannot be identified through any kind of public information like publications or any kind of reports or websites should not be able to identify that this so and so XYZ person has some stomach issue. That should not be identifiable. That's breach of data, right? Third, unethical activity is not respecting rights of vulnerable groups such as children, mentally handicapped individuals, the aged, prisoners, illiterate, those with low social status. This is a very huge issue. This brings back to that example where if you just watch that series Humans, you will see some of these reflections, right? Where it could be that children who are not able to comprehend things or what a particular thing can have an implication on are tested on with something like which they are not supposed to be tested on, and they are not aware of the risks or problems which they can face with this particular test. Sometimes it's a way of earning money. So very interestingly, as I speak, I've seen for example some programs in the US where they do this huge clinical trials where they're looking at 100 volunteers for a particular test which has some possible risks and other things. They Some of them could be children, so you have to clearly lay out either to a parent or to a guardian, like who is able to understand and comprehend and see whether this particular research is what their children are going to possibly participate in, given all the risks or not. So that has to be very clearly laid out, right? Sometimes mentally handicapped individuals, right, they have to be shown their respect. So we have to be very, very respectful of all people while doing the ethical considerations, be it somebody with a social status which is low or high. So we have to be very, very mindful of that, right? Especially children. We have to be very focused on mentally handicapped individuals. They should not be considered as guinea pigs or subjects whom we can test on. That is very, very unethical, so that should never be done. The aged, sometimes we may think, oh, this person is a 85 or 95-year-old person. If we do a particular clinical test or procedure on this person, this may be fine even if this person dies. That's completely wrong, right? So these kind of thought process should not be there. Prisoners, sometimes people think of prisoners as somebody who has already done a crime and should be punished, so let us do some clinical tests on them. Should not be done. That is ethically wrong. Illiterate, illiterate people are who cannot again understand or comprehend what you are trying to explain to them. They are not literate, right? If you tell them this drug is going to possibly do this and that, or not tell them, they are not going to refuse because they are in dire need of money. So if somebody is participating in a research in dire need of money and we are misusing that effect due to their social status or them being illiterate, that is completely unethical research practice. So this has to be very strongly followed, right? Those with low social status, and that's a very well known fact, people with low social status get always targeted by a lot of clinical studies and these kind of things. This is across the nations, right? Like this is we have seen this in Africa, we have seen this in US, across countries these kind of things have happened. And I'm going to take some examples of how the different codes of conduct of the ethical practices have evolved, and you'll be very surprised to see that they are not in our countries but they are in the other countries from which these codes have been enforced. So Even though we may always think that in uh, South Asian countries where we are trying to develop quickly, these kind of activities happen. That's not always true. There are many researches which are done in a much more ethical fashion in India as compared to other places in the world, right? It's not always how we think about a particular research, it's holding the right ethical norms. So this is just to give you an outline of what is good and bad. That way we are all well versed while conducting any sort of research with soft tissues, right? So not having due consideration of the environment is the last one. We have to be duly considered of the environment. So for example, if somebody is trying to operate on a person in a very shabby clinical setting where there is basically no facility of suturing, no cleaning, uh, blood blood bank is not around, and there are not proper doctors who can operate on things, these kind of tests are completely unethical. It has to have a proper clinic, proper, typically part of a hospital where things can be supervised and things like that, where proper clinical tests are done. If you read a lot of news, there was a recent news where some doctors in some part of Delhi were trying to operate on some like some of the patients by showing that they're doctors and doing certain operations when they did not have the skills to do that, right? So that happens not only all across India but in other countries also. So these kind of things, environments have to be placed with due consideration while looking at all the ethical laws and how things have to be properly done, right? So the environment has to be good. Whenever you're looking at doing a subject testing or participant testing in a clinical environment, uh, if there is a risk of injury, if there is a risk of some disease, that has to be clearly laid out, and proper provisions have to be done so that these volunteers are taken care of if they do agree to the study after understanding all the limitations, right? So with this we are going to continue talking about ethics for another lecture or so, like because I think this is a very important criteria. We would also like to look into what comes within an ethical proposal, and what all are the important guidelines and rules to be followed in order to apply for an ethical clearance, in order to be able to do soft tissue testing research. So that's the overall goal. So we'll be moving towards that in the upcoming lecture. So just stay tuned and we'll see you again, right? Thank you.